Until 1782, English convicts were transported to America. However, in 1783, the American War of Independence ended. America refused to accept any more convicts, so England had to find somewhere else to send their prisoners. New South Wales was a solution. Parliament was weary of this idea at first, as shown in the quote from Parliament Committee in 1785, which says that the old system of transporting to America answered every good purpose that we could have expected from it, and they even tried to send a few more convicts to America later in the transportation, but America still refused to let them. Life in Britain was very hard. As new machines were invented, people were no longer needed to do farming jobs, so they moved to the cities. The cities became overcrowded. Many people didn't have a job and were very poor. People stole things to survive. Minor crimes such as stealing items worth more than 1 shilling, cutting down a tree in an orchard, or stealing livestock were punishable by transportation, such as Robert Hobbs, who was sentenced to 7 years of transportation for stealing calico, and Ernest Wentworth, a baker, who was convicted for selling bad bread to a royal establishment.
Once on the journey, their lives became pretty cruel. Convicts were housed below the deck in cramped areas where they slept in hammocks. The only time they were allowed up on deck was when they needed fresh air and exercise, and that was different lengths of time below deck depending on how nice the captain was. Conditions started out okay on the first few fleets, but after that the conditions grew fairly harsh, with cruel masters, harsh discipline, and scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid. The officers were drunks and the captains were harsh. James Bell's diary even states that he found one officer asleep on watch, so drunk he couldn't even understand what had happened after there was an outbreak and the captain had cut his head open. Once the ships would arrive to Australia, they were described as filthy beyond description. Some convicts were lying dead with heavy iron shackles still on, while many more died while they were coming to the hospital. The death rate on all ships later in the voyages were extremely high, and mutinies were occurring due to that harsh conditions. The route they took depended on how big the ship was. At the start of the transport, when they used small ships, they made several stops for supplies and repairs, but later on, when they used bigger ships, they made less stops. By then, the British had ports for them too, so they would stop at ports like Gibraltar, a port in the West Indies, and the Cape of Good Hope before reaching Australia. The hard conditions soon led to mutinies. In August 1783, a mutiny happened on the Swift. It was traveling to Nova Scotia with 143 convicts. The convicts waited till they got to a channel and then took it over and ran it ashore. Most escaped, but 39 were recaptured and 26 tried again. 7 were hanged while the rest were sentenced to America for life. Then again on April 2nd, 1784, the Mercury set a sail for America with 179 convicts. Convicts rose up against the crew near the Scilly Islands. The Mercury was found at Torbony, where 66 of the convicts were retaken. These convicts were tried again, and 2 were hung while the others went on the first fleet to Australia. But not all mutinies happened from the convicts. On the ships, sometimes people would attack and capture the boats, as in 1797 when the Lady Shore, a cargo ship loaded with 66 convicts heading to Australia, was seized by French soldiers. They murdered the captain, and 28 people were set adrift to Brazil. All the other survivors were held captive in Spanish South America, till later sent back to England.
The prisoners transported to New South Wales were sent to colonies in places such as Norfolk Island, Van Diemen's Land, Port Macquarie, and Moreton Bay. The convicts here were treated badly, especially the women. This is seen in the creation of female factories. A female factory was an assigned depot, refuge, workhouse, a marriage bureau, hospital, and prison for unassigned women. Women here were put to work doing tasks such as wool picking, cloth scouring, carding, weaving, laundry, oakum picking, needlework, cleaning duties, straw plaiting, and hard labor such as stone breaking and oakum picking. Mothers were separated from their children when they reached the age of 4. The children were sent to orphan schools and had no contact with their mothers until their release, and oftentimes longer depending on their circumstances. Men were allowed to come to the factories and have their pick of women to marry. Between 1827 and 1843, riots occurred in the factories. Most riots occurred as a result of overcrowding and inequitable arrangements. Secondary punishments applied to women who rioted, absconded, were absent, insolent, disorderly in their conduct, and for women on release from theft, stabbing, forgery, found in carnal connection, drunk, vagrant, pregnant, or of bad character. Punishment included demotion to the third class, head shaving, hard labor, and solitary confinement fed on bread and water for up to 21 days, or exile to Moreton Bay. A man named Arthur Bowes wrote about women convicts coming to the colonies in his journal on February 6, 1788. He said, when women convicts first arrived in the colonies, it was said that they were strictly searched for things they could have stolen from the ship, even though most of them were clean and reasonably well dressed, and probably only committed small crimes. The searches found nothing. Bowes also wrote in his journal about what happened after they arrived on February 7, 1788. He said that after the women were settled in, the governor called all the convicts to the reading of the governor's commission, where it is said that he harangued the convicts and was convinced that many of them were incorrigible. They had strict rules, such as any men seen going into a women's tent would be fired upon, convicts who didn't work would not be fed, and stealing the most trifling article of stock or provision should be punished by death. Arthur Bowes also states that, however, such severity might militate against his humanity and feelings towards his fellow creatures, yet that justice demanded such rigid execution of the laws, and they might implicitly reply upon justice taking place. A few months later, Captain Arthur Phillips wrote a letter to Lord Sydney on May 16, 1788, claiming that the officers weren't doing a good enough job and needed to point out for punishments for convicts they saw idle or straggling in the woods. The colonies also weren't getting the necessary provisions. The surgeon in Sydney Cove said in a letter to Captain Arthur Phillips, among the troops, their wives and children, as well as among convicts who have been ill, the want of necessities to aid the operation of medicine has been most materially and sensibly felt. My duty leads me to mention this circumstance to your Excellency in order that you may use all means for their procurement as may seem most expedient. I beg leave to add blankets and sheets for the hospital, none of which are in the colony, although they are essential and absolutely necessary. The want of them makes that observance and attention to cleanliness utterly impossible. With respect to necessities, our situation here, constantly living on salt provisions without any possibility of a change, makes them more necessary than perhaps in any other quarter of the globe. The convicts, as it is said, only committed petty crimes, but their time in the colonies and the harsh conditions and punishments they faced turned them into ruthless criminals. Arthur Phillips wrote in a letter to Lord Sydney that the convicts destroy and rob in spite of every possible precaution, and punishments have no effect. And in one case, 2 convicts were found murdered by natives. A lieutenant found that one of the convicts had killed a native a few days earlier, cutting him across the belly, and said, I have no doubt but this native, having been murdered, occasioned their seeking revenge, and proved fatal to those who were not concerned. They have attacked our people when they have met them unarmed, but that did not happen until they had been very ill treated by us in the lower part of the harbor and fired upon at Botany Bay by the French. It is also written about in the newspaper called The Spectator They said punishment of convicts for crimes committed in the penal colonies are horrible. In 1834, 1,000 persons were employed in the chain gangs of New South Wales, and in 1837, 700 in those of Van Diemen's Land. The soldiers employed to guard these chain gangs frequently find their own friends and relations among them and themselves become drunken and vicious in the extreme. For crimes of the greatest magnitude not punishable by death, convicts are transported to Norfolk Island, Moreton Bay, and Port Arthur. Port Arthur is on a small and barren peninsula connected with Van Diemen's Land by a narrow strip of land. Norfolk Island is a beautiful volcanic island about 1,000 miles from the eastern shores of Australia and except in one place inaccessible to boats. This lovely spot has been converted into a perfect hell. The conditions of the convicts is one of unmitigable wretchedness. To escape from it, men have chopped off the heads of their fellow prisoners with hoes, knowing they should be immediately sent to Sydney to be tried and hanged. Attempts at mutiny have not been uncommon at Norfolk Island. In 1834, mutineers took possession of the island and killed some guards. They were subsequently overpowered and 11 were executed. To Judge Burton, who tried them, one of these men observed in a manner which the judge said drew tears from his eyes and wrung his heart. Let a man be what he will, when he comes here, he is soon as bad as the rest. A man's heart is taken from him, and there is given to him the heart of a beast. And murders and attempts at murder are as common in New South Wales as petty larcenies in England. Transportation to the colony of New South Wales was officially abolished on October 1st, 1850, and in 1853, the order to abolish transportation to Van Diemen's Land was formally announced. South Australia and the Northern Territory of South Australia never accepted convicts directly from England, but still had many ex-convicts from the other states. After they had been given limited freedom, many convicts were allowed to travel as far as New Zealand to make a fresh start, even if they were not allowed to return home to England. At the time, there was also a great deal of pressure to abolish transportation. Given that only a small percentage of the convicted population was locked up, many believed that transportation to Australia was an inappropriate punishment. This, combined with the employed needs of Australia's thriving population, ensured the abolition of convict transportation.